Okay, let's see. Okay, let's see. Okay. So we're just missing. Got it. Okay. So we're just missing. Got it. Okay, I think I had a feedback loop there. I'm not entirely sure what caused it, but I think I fixed it. Okay, I think I had a feedback loop there. I'm not entirely sure what caused it, but I think I fixed it. Okay, I had a feedback loop there. No, got it. Okay, I knew I had the stream running somewhere. All right, welcome back. Now that technical difficulties are kind of sorted out. So to refresh on where we're at, Thursday we looked at 9.0, which kind of gave us an overview of how to work with data storage, namely how to persist data and files so that they stick around even after you leave the app. So that's where we're kind of started. So on 9.1, we talked about shared preferences, which is one way to store some settings so that they are preserved through rebooting some application-wide settings. Now, Alex, is it an audio issue? Is it a video issue? What issue are you having? Because you say you're having an issue with the stream. Okay. All right. So our main focus here in lesson 9 is in data storage. So where we're going, we covered in 9.1, we talked about how to use shared preferences to store things. What we're going to talk about in 9.2 is how to use settings, the preferences API, to create setting screens for that. So we've made the back end part that's still shared preferences. That hasn't really changed. But what we're going to do now today is covering the UI portion of it, the widgets. So that's what we're going to be doing now. So you refer to this as settings or the preference API. You'll see kind of both things in the documentation. We'll call it preferences. We'll call it settings. Anytime you see both of those things, they're the same thing. So first we want to talk about what are settings, and we're going to talk about then what the setting screens are, how to set those up. We'll talk about how to implement the SettingsActivity as well as the SettingsFragment. We'll talk about how to work with default settings and how to initialize those. Then we'll also talk about saving or saving and retrieving the current settings values. We'll also talk a little bit about how to respond to changes in the settings. That's a little bit of a deeper topic than this lesson really goes over. So we're really only going to kind of skim the surface of kind of listening to settings changes. We'll also talk a little bit about the summaries that show up on the settings screen and how to kind of dynamically change that. And then finally, we'll talk about the SettingsActivity template, which is something that's built into Android Studio and ideally makes this process a little bit easier to get up and running. Whether or not it does that is kind of really up to you, especially if you're doing a really simple settings screen. Then using the settings activity template doesn't necessarily save much time, if any. But if you're doing something more complex, it can potentially save you time. So let's talk about what are app settings. Actually push this into full screen. So as far as what are apps settings, users configure, they're used for allowing users configure the different behaviors and features in your app. So some common examples might be to set your home location. What's your home address? If you need that, whether for shipping or billing, whatever those kind of things may be. If you're showing a map and you want it by default to open up at their home address when it starts, you want a place to set that. Also, maybe units of measurement. Say you can do metric or you can do English units. You may want to change that. Centimeters, inches, miles, kilometers, all depending on what makes sense for your app. Hours, seconds, minutes, things like that. Also, sometimes you may want to do some settings with the notification behavior for that app. It used to be that all of the settings for notifications we did through the app, through the settings screen. Now with notification channels, a lot of that setting, a lot of those configurations have been moved over to the notification channel page. So there's not as many notification settings here with modern apps, again, because of those notification channels. But what you still may want to see in here is things like the intervals, because the interval is something that you don't see on the notification channel page. So you might want to say, we'll check for new news articles once a day, check for it once an hour, check for it every 15 minutes. That's probably something that you want to be configurable to the user. So those kind of intervals are still something we want to put in a settings screen, or in some sense to turn them on or off. But a lot of settings that we used to put here, like should it vibrate, should it make a sound, what sound should it make, what ringtone should it use, those things we don't put in our settings screen as much anymore, simply because the notification channels can be configured that way by the user. So that's kind of where that's been pushed now. It's intended for values that don't change infrequently, but is relevant to most users. So you think that most users, a lot of your user base, will probably want to change these settings, but more than likely they will only do it seldom, right? This is not necessarily a good place to put settings that the user is going to change all of the time. So if, say, you're an e-commerce store and it's a setting that it's something that they're going to change every time they check out, it may not be a good fit for your settings screen. But if it's like, say, well, by default, I would like to have my delivery method be set to pickup. By default, I want it set to pickup, or I want it set to 3-day shipping, 2-day shipping, so the user doesn't have to remember to change that every time. That may be something that's convenient, but then also for things like that, you may also want to give them an option of saying, well, I don't want it to pre-select one for me, depending on the user's specific case. So it's kind of one thing you got to keep track of and think about with your settings. Some things make sense to have on a settings screen, and some things maybe that's a little bit more cumbersome, sending them to another screen when it would just make sense to keep them on the screen where they're going to use it. So that's the thing to keep in mind. The things you stick on the settings screen are the things that they're not going to change very often. Okay, so some examples here with different settings that you might set up. We've got what's your favorite destination. Here we've kind of set it to San Francisco. You can see it's kind of an edit box, so the user can type in whatever they want into that box, as you can kind of see up here. And then it's got an OK or cancel button. So that will kind of pop up in a dialog, give the user an option to enter a city, and then glow away. You can also do switches or checkboxes like this, which are just a simple off and on, or you can have pop-ups here with radio buttons that say, well, pick one of these options. So these are kind of the main three types of settings that we see. Either there's kind of an edit text setting, there's a switch setting, or there's what we call a list setting or a list preference. You'll notice the text that appears under here. We'll talk about that, but that's what we refer to as the summary. The summary kind of summarizes usually what your current selection is and what that means. So there's a few different ways to typically get to the settings screen. One of those ways is through the navigation drawer. If you're going to have a navigation drawer, typically that should have a settings button in that. So if you kind of remember when we covered that a few lessons ago, that's navigation drawers, you pull it in from the left side, or you have the triple hamburger to open it. Typically you're only going to have that navigation drawer back up in your main screen, your main activity, where the user starts. You're not necessarily going to put that on all screens. You can, but usually you just have that on the main activity. The other way that we see it more commonly, especially because not all apps have a navigation drawer, is you're going to put it into the options menu, which would be the little triple dot menu that you've seen up in the top. You pop that down, settings is in there. So that's the way that we're going to do basically all the apps that we do for this class. Is if we need a settings screen, we're going to put it into that triple dot, that options menu, and let the user pull it down from there. That's how the labs are going to be set up as well. So for setup screens, settings screen, they can work a few different ways. You can potentially be broken into more than one screen. It could just be one screen. It could be broken up into more than one screen depending on how many settings you have. So just a general rule of thumb, you want that number of options to be that are there to be a manageable number. You really don't want to overload the user with way too many options or options that they're probably not going to set. And you kind of want to put options there that they would predict or expect. You know, I would expect to have a setting for XYZ in my app, and so that should be there. So you kind of have to think about, well, what are the things that the user is more than likely going to want to configure, and as well as oftentimes actually having to talk to users and figure out, you know, once the app is released, you know, here are some things that maybe annoy me, or here are some things that I don't like, here are some things I wish I could configure. Oftentimes that'll be one of those things that you get back from user feedback. Will say, I really wish this was configurable, and then it's something you can add. So some of that, just knowing what the right settings to put there, comes down to a lot to knowing your users and knowing your app and knowing your user, knowing your base. So if there are 7 or less settings, typically we say we'll put that all on one screen, arrange the most high priority ones at the top. So the ones that users need to pay the most attention to or most likely to change, those are up at the top, and then it goes down in kind of priority or importance. So the ones at the bottom are the ones that the user's probably less likely to touch. So most users will touch the ones at the top, and very few users will touch the one at the bottom. If you get to settings or more, you're going to want to group those into different sections, different groups, and we'll kind of look at an example with that, so that the user can say, well, okay, so these settings go together and those settings go together. If you get to even more, get to 16 plus settings, then the general recommendation is to start breaking it down into more than one screen, because 16 or more settings is just way too much to have on one screen. It's user overload. So we're going to say at the top here, maybe here's the display settings. You click on that, and then that takes you to a further settings screen where you can drill down further. Or you go to sound and notification, that goes down here. And this is just showing it as an example from the Android operating system settings screen, but you can really do these kind of things with your own app. So sometimes you'll have them on separate screens, depending on how many settings you have. If you have fewer settings, they'll all be on one screen. Realistically, for the things that we want to do in this class, we are not going to be building tremendously huge apps. I mean, we're going to be building them to the size that we can in the time allotted, but really it's going to be less than 16 settings that you have for this particular class. So keeping them all on one setting, on one page is going to be good enough for us. We won't really need to move these into separate screens. Again, this really only happens with larger long-term apps where you're going to get up to that large number of 16 plus settings. But you generally want to kind of thin it out as you go along, figure out what settings you need, what settings you don't. So one thing to know as we're going through here, we've talked about views as we work through our UI. You'll remember that everything that we create and put on a screen is typically a view or a subclass, some sort of subclass of the view class, whether that be our layouts, whether that be our edit text or buttons. All of those are subclasses of views. Now, when we're creating a settings screen, we don't actually deal directly with views. There's tools here that kind of automatically build and manage the views for us. So we don't actually have to get into the fine-grained nitty-gritty of views as long as we're building a settings screen. What we're going to work with instead is something called a preference. Okay, so a preference correlates to an individual setting that you have on your settings screen. Okay. So we're going to be working with preferences screen and kind of a similar sort of layout editor. As we build up the settings screen, we won't actually be using views, but it will work in kind of a similar manner. In the sense that it's kind of like working with a linear layout. They're not really layout options when layout managers, when you're dealing with settings. It's all really just always going to be a linear manager that's laid out, linear layout manager that's arranged in a vertical orientation. There's no constraint layout here. We don't need to kind of get to that granularity for setting screens. So to start off, to define a preference screen, the first thing we have to do is create a preferences file. So we'll need to create an XML directory in the resources folder. That typically won't be there by default because, again, there are a lot of apps that may not need it. So you create that XML directory, you put a preferences.xml file in it, and then the root tag of that is a preference screen. So it's going to start with preference screen, end with preference screen. That's kind of the start and end of that file. Okay. To kind of see an example of what that might look like, here's kind of an example of that preferences.xml. So it's going to start with this preference screen tag. It's going to end with that closing tag. And inside of that preference screen, you're more than likely going to have one or more categories. So you have preference category that starts here, ends there. This is the flight preferences category. You're usually going to have more than one. You can kind of see that they have a heading. So that flight preferences title is showing up here at the top, and it allows us to kind of group together settings so that they're not all just kind of loosely floating around. The user doesn't see just this long string of settings. It's kind of like, okay, these settings go together, these settings go together, these settings go together. That makes more sense. So we're going to start with the preference category, and then beneath that you'll see that there's two settings. So there's a checkbox preference setting, there's an edit text preference. So the checkbox preference just shows up here. There's some text, which is that wait for meals. That's the title. Down beneath that we have the summary, and then we have the actual checkbox control here. So you can uncheck and check that, and then this summary will change. So you'll say, right now, because it's checked, it says you will be woken for meals. If you were to uncheck that, it will probably say you will not be woken for meals. Also then we've got the favorite city. This is an edit text preference, so the way that works is you tap on that setting, it pops up a dialog with that edit box, the OK and cancel button. You hit OK and it saves it, and then the summary updates. So it would say your favorite city is London. If you change that to say Hong Kong, it would say your favorite city is Hong Kong, something like that. So that's kind of the hierarchy, the structure of that preferences.xml file. It's going to have a preference screen at the top, and then it's going to have individual preferences beneath that. Categories are optional. You don't have to divide things into categories. You can have a long list of preferences, but it is generally recommended to use categories to kind of group your relevant settings together. So at least there's some sort of logical order to how they're arranged. Okay. So every preference that we have, every preference on this preference screen must have a key. Android is going to use that key to actually save the settings file. It's actually the same one we're going to use to read it from shared preferences. So that's going to go back to how it's actually stored. As a general rule, with the categories don't have to have a key, but you will probably want to add one at some point, simply because there's another option in there that says, okay, well, I've got too many settings in my group, so you can say, well, let's only show the first 3. And then the rest will be under an advanced section or advanced drop down. So in order to make that work, in order to make that collapse, you have to assign a key to your groups as well, not just your individual preferences. So you may want to keep that in mind. So every preference does have to have a key. So here we've got an edit text preference. Its title is favorite city, so that's going to appear here. And then we've got app key is set to fav_city. So again, fav_city is what we're going to use in the code to refer to this setting. Okay, and we can also have switches. Switches are kind of a similar setup. If I'm going to say, let's make a switch preference, here are the properties I need to set on that. So it's going to be inside of a preference screen. I'm going to have a switch preference tag, and then it's going to be, okay, my key is social. By default, it's checked. That's default value true. And then I'm going to say, okay, let's use this title and let's use this summary. Now you can see, because of how I've written that up, @string, you can see that that's coming from a strings.xml file. That's a string resource, because we obviously need to translate the text that appears here. So that's a good rule of thumb. You want to make sure that both the title and the summary are translated, so you want to pull those from a string resource file. So some of these examples like this shows the app title just hard-coded there. You can do that, but you really should extract it into a strings.xml for translation purposes and such. Okay. So on the switch preference, I kind of went over these all real quick. App key, that's what we're going to use to save and store it, to store and reload it from shared preferences. Default value is what we want it to be initially when the user hasn't picked anything yet. The title is that top part that's going to show up, and then the kind of the name of the setting that the user is going to see, and then the summary is that text that appears beneath, and generally we expect that summary to show the current value of that setting, or what that current value means. Okay. So for an edit text, here's kind of how it's going to look. We're going to have, again, a key. So here I've got user display name as my key. And then I can set some other settings here. So capitalize, input type, max lines. All of those are typical settings that you might see on an edit text. So all of those settings also apply here for an edit text preference. So we're saying, okay, well, we want to capitalize the first letter in each word is what we're saying here by capitalize words. So we're going to say, okay, let's capitalize the J, capitalize the S, because we're going to capitalize that. Input type would be text cap words. Again, that goes into, hey, we have a full name here that we're trying to enter, and we want to capitalize the words. Max line says, okay, you only get one line of text to to enter. If you wanted to say, hey, the user can enter something maybe longer, you might set that to say 3 or 5 so that they have some more space to enter. But here we're saying you can only enter one line of text. The default value we're pulling from a preference file. So we're saying by default it's pref default display name. Depending on your specific setup, if that's something that should be translated, then that would be something you put in a string resource. Sometimes, however, these edit texts, you may not want the default value translated. So it is okay sometimes to have that default value here to be something you've actually hard-coded. So for instance, if it's a URL, I would expect that URL to be hard-coded here instead of moving it into a strings XML file. So the default value depends on, should you translate it, should you not translate it? Sometimes the answer is yes, sometimes the answer is no. With the title and the summary, for sure, though, those are things you want to typically translate. Now, so I'm going to set the title here from a strings XML. Notice, however, I'm not specifying the quote-unquote summary here. What I have is I'm saying app uses simple summary provider. So by default with an edit text, the actual summary text that it shows is blank. So that means with kind of the default setup of an edit text preference, you can't actually see the value that the user's entered, which is not very user friendly. So you could set the summary and hard code it to say your setting, but then it will just always say your setting. So we want to change it dynamically based on what the user enters. If you add this setting, use simple summary provider, what it does is it will automatically take the value that the user's entered, or the default value, whatever's currently set, and go ahead and display that as a summary. And that way you don't have to write any additional code to keep the summary up to date for an edit text. And we'll see that that's available actually on another setting as well here in a second. So that's, if you're creating an edit text, I would strongly recommend that you probably want to add that setting in there. Use simple summary provider, just so you don't have to write any code to keep it up to date. It'll automatically take care of it. Okay. The third kind of setting that we can have is what's called a list preference. So a list preference shows up like this. You've got your title up above and then the summary text beneath. And then when you tap on it, it will open up a dialog with the different options that you can pick. So here we've got always, when possible, never, and then there would also be an OK count. There would also be a cancel button down here if you decide you didn't want to change the setting. So that's kind of how that looks. Again, we have a default. We have a key. So the key is add friends in here. Default value we've set to never. So these can be different values. We've got those three. Note, however, that the default value that I've got here isn't actually like, it's a lowercase n. So the value is actually kind of like, if you remember working with combo boxes, drop downs, typically you have one value that you show to the user, and then you have another value that you use in your code. So there's two more settings in here. We have the entries and we have the entry values. So this entries is an array. You see array resource. So I would save this as like a string array. And that's the options that are being shown to the user. So that shows them as always, when possible, never. That's actually what's in there, is the text that the user sees, and that's the one that we want to translate. On the other hand, we have this other array, which is, for example, list values. Those are the values that are behind the scenes. These entry values are the values that are kind of behind the scenes that we store and save to shared preferences, and we use in our actual code. And that's to divorce us from display, kind of, maybe we want to display it this way, but we want to have a value behind the scenes that's not translated into different languages, as well as just having some more stability around what those values are. So these are the value entries, is the values that the user is going to see, and those should be translated. Entry values is the users that is the values that we're going to use in our logic, and those should not be translated. Those should stay as they're just values. So this is where this one would have never with a lowercase, whereas this one has never maybe with an uppercase because we want to show it that way. Same thing as previous, we have the title here, so that title is what's going to show up here. And then we also want to add use a simple summary provider. So just like with the edit text, by default the summary is left blank. The user has no way to know what they picked without tapping on the settings. So if you set this to use the simple summary provider, it will automatically take the current setting and display it in the summary. So both for the edit text preference and the list preference, generally you're going to want to use this. If you don't set it to use simple summary provider, you're going to need to hook up your own listener with some logic to automatically update that summary, which we'll talk about later in this lesson. But for most cases, this is really sufficient to keep the summary up to date. So list preference, we talked about, hey, the default value is set to never. Entries are the values, the labels of the radio buttons that they're going to see. Entry values is the actual value, quote unquote, that we're going to save that's behind those radio buttons. And then simple summary provider is going to automatically update that summary. Okay, so the preference class is kind of the base for all of these different kinds of settings. In fact, preference is also the base for preference category. So preference category is technically a preference as well. So the preference provides a view for each of these, all the views necessary for each of these settings. It already deals with that, already hooks up with all the listeners. It will automatically save your settings to shared preference with the key that you give it. So you don't have to deal with saving, loading that. You just create the settings screen and it automatically is there saved to a file for you. Okay, whenever the user changes the settings. They don't have to hit any sort of submit button, save button, they just change the setting and that's it. It's good. So a few different settings that you can, different kinds of settings that you can use. You can use the switch preference, which is that toggle on off. You can also use a checkbox preference, which shows kind of basically works in the same way, but it shows up as a checkbox rather than a switch. But it's still a true false value. We can have the edit text preference, which pops up that dialog with the edit text. You can have list preference. If you say, well, I only want the user to pick from A, B, or C, that's what we're going to use with this radio button. Another kind of preference that you can use is the ringtone preference, and that would let the user pick what sort of ringtone they wanted to play when maybe some sort of event occurs. Now, usually this ringtone preference was used for notifications. With the advent of notification channels, we don't have as much use for this ringtone preference. There may still be places where you want to use it. Say you're building some sort of alarms into your app that you want to say, well, this goes off at 12:35, or the user has some sort of countdown timer and it'll go off in 2 minutes. That may be still a case where you'd want to have a ringtone preference. But as far as notifications are concerned, that's now governed by notification channels. There's two basic classes for grouping settings together. So first there's the preference screen tag, and that's always going to be the root of your preference layout hierarchy. If you have more than one screen, then you're going to have more than one of these preference files as well, each of which is going to be rooted with the preference screen tag. Within a preference screen, we can group things into categories. That's where we're going to use the preference category tag, and that's for groups of settings. So how do we implement this activity? So there's a few things we need to do. The way that we implement the settings activity is always using a fragment. So if you remember right, if we kind of backtrack a little bit, a fragment is just sort of a mini activity or sort of a view. It's part of the screen, but maybe not the whole screen. in this case, it's actually going to be the settings fragment is going to be the only thing that we show on that settings activity. So it internally has a lot of the code built in that deals with the saving and loading. It's able to take our preference XML file and turn that into all of the views that are needed. So we don't even create a layout XML for this screen because we don't actually even need a layout. We just need a preference file. So with setting this up, we're going to use the Jetpack app compat activity, and then we're going to use that with the PreferenceFragment compat. Historically, there were a few different ways to do this. Originally, in one version, when this was originally introduced to Android, we had maybe the preference activity and the preference fragment, but those were introduced. But even before those were introduced, there were versions of Android that didn't have preferences, and then they didn't have fragments. So we had to, in order to support the activities that don't have fragments and the activities that don't have preferences, and we had to use those compatibility support libraries. So that kind of created a bit of a jumble. It's like, well, do you use the preference activity and the preference fragment that are built into the core Android framework, or do I use the support versions of those? And that kind of depending on which version of Android you were running. Well, what's happened recently, and this is one of the things that's kind of made the labs a little bit, made some changes to the labs, which we'll go over, is that these have now been integrated to Jetpack. So app compat activity, preference fragment, compat, both of these things used to be part of the legacy support libraries. They're now part of Jetpack, the Jetpack support libraries, basically. And they've actually been deprecated in the core API. So if you're trying to use, say, preference activity or preference fragment directly, you'll find a lot of errors that they are deprecated. Android says don't use these anymore because of all the compatibility issues. Now, the upside of them moving these things to Jetpack is now Android and Google are able to update these on a more frequent basis. They're able to fix bugs rather than kind of having to let them linger because they were tied to a specific version of the OS. It also means that you can say, well, I don't want the preference API, so I just won't include that dependency in my Gradle. So one of the things that we'll need to know with all of that is there is a dependency for preferences that we need to add to Gradle to use this. We'll go over that in the practical portion, what that dependency is that we need to add. If we don't add it, then we're going to have some issues. But the dependency that they tell you to use in the labs is the wrong dependency. It's the big thing. So there's a few different steps to implement the settings activity. Okay, so to rehash where we're at, we're going to have a fragment. That's going to do the core work of turning our preference XML into views, and then we're going to put that inside of a settings activity. So to create this, we first need to create that preference screen file. So we're going to create that under res.xml preferences.xml. So that's going to be our core preference screen file, and that's where we're going to put all our preferences. The next thing we need to do is create an activity for these settings, and then we're going to create a specialized fragment for the settings, and we'll tie those two things together using the fragment manager to display the settings fragment in the settings activity. And then once we've done all that, now we've got a working settings screen. We still can't necessarily get to it from anywhere, so we've got to put controls, whether it be in the menu or the navigation drawer, to be able to actually get to the settings activity. So that's the last step that we need to do, is create that navigation pathway. Okay. So with setting up the activity, you can start it with an empty activity. You can start it with a basic activity template. If you start it with an empty activity, it's not going to start with an options menu, so you'll have to add that menu resource, as well as needing to then hook up the menu to actually take you to the settings screen. If you're using the basic activity template, basic activity already comes with the menu built in, already comes with an options menu built in, and it will already put a settings option for you there. So that does reduce how much code or how much work that you have to do. Usually if you start from the basic activity, that will be a little bit easier to get up and running. Now, it does add that menu item for settings. However, it doesn't hook that up. It doesn't make that option actually do anything. It will be displayed, but it won't do anything. So we still have to go through the work of making it actually work. So you're asking about, will the settings activity already generate all this for us? No. It'll generate parts of this, but one of the things that the template won't do is it won't hook up the navigation. The template that we'll talk about at the end of this will not hook up the navigation from the other screens to your actual settings activity. It'll just create the settings activity. So it only does part of the work. So to create the settings activity, the settings activity needs to extend app compat activity. It's actually the same thing we've done for all of our activities in the past. Inside of the onCreate, rather than expanding a layout, because remember normally we would call setContentView, that would expand our layout, inflate it from our layout file to the actual views and controls on the UI. We're not actually going to call setContentView and set in our settings activity, because we're just going to completely skip the layout. Now, assuming we completely skip the layout, we need to then tell it to show that fragment. So we're going to say, get this support fragment manager. We're going to tell it to begin transaction saying, okay, I want to make changes to the fragments that are shown, but kind of hold on it, take all the things I want you to do, but don't do them yet until I hit commit, at which point all the stuff that I do in the middle actually happens. So I begin transaction, do some things, and then commit it, and that's what makes the actual change happen. So here I'm saying replace, so I'm going to say android.r.id.content. We're going to replace the core content of this activity with the settings fragment. Now, you'll remember that when we're working with layouts and when we're working with our different views, remember we have to assign them ID. We have to assign every view on our screen an ID. So typically that would be like RID my thing, right? If you see this at the beginning, android.r, that means that it's an ID or a resource that's built into the core Android framework. So this ID content isn't something I have defined in my app. It's something that's defined in the system itself. So every activity always has this RID content. It's always the root. And typically we replace it with whatever's in our layout by calling setContentView. SetContentView actually replaces this ID kind of behind the scenes. So because we're not creating a layout, that's where we're going. If we wanted to put some other things on the screen and not just have the settings fragment, which is really a rare thing, but if you did, then you would create a layout, and then this would go into a specific ID, probably a frame layout somewhere in that more custom layout. But assuming you don't have a layout for this screen, which is kind of the norm, that's what you'll see here. But if you do have your own layout, then that will be the idea of a frame layout. So setting this up, the settings activity class, here's the entire settings activity class. This is basically what you do regardless of what app you're building. So we say public class settings activity extends app compat activity, and then inside of there we need to override the onCreate method. So in onCreate, we're going to run that block of code to say, hey, I want my settings fragment, my custom settings fragment that I've created, and I'm going to replace that here. So that's the entire settings activity. That's really all the code you have to have inside a settings activity. Now to look at the fragment. So the fragment needs to extend PreferenceFragment compat. Again, that needs to be the one from the Jetpack library now. We need to implement the onCreate preference method. which is interesting because historically, if you're creating a view, that's not the method that you implement. So if you're creating a fragment, that's not the method that you normally implement. But this is specific for dealing with preferences. Also inside of onCreatePreferences, we may need to call setOnPreferenceChangeListener to handle any sort of changes to the preferences to be able to update summaries and different things on that actual screen. Now, if we need to respond to changes to those settings on other screens, then we're actually going to call the setOnPreferenceChangeListener in those relevant places. So here, this listener is really just listening for while you're on that screen and affecting this screen. But you may need to hook up a preference change listener in other places in your app. So traditionally, when you're creating a fragment, and if you create a brand new one, if you create a brand new fragment class, it will automatically create a onCreateView method for you. Now, that onCreateView method usually is where we would inflate the layout for the fragment. But because we're a subclass of PreferenceFragment Compat, we do not want to change any of the behavior of onCreateView. So it will automatically create that onCreateView. We're going to actually throw that method away because we don't want to do anything in onCreateView whatsoever when we're working with a PreferenceFragment Compat. Anything we do there is just going to cause issues with the way the preference need to get set up because it's going to happen at the wrong time. So don't implement onCreateView. Just throw that away when you're dealing with preference fragments. Is what we're going to implement instead is onCreatePreferences instead of onCreateView. So onCreateView is already implemented by PreferenceFragment Compat, and that deals with all the logic it needs to do to set things up. We just override onCreatePreferences. Okay. So our SettingsFragment class is going to look like this. And just like the SettingsActivity, this is the entire class. And most of the time, you don't need to write much more than this. Most of the time, this is it. That's it. You don't have to change it. So we're going to call it the SettingsFragment class. It's going to extend PreferenceFragment Compat. I'm going to overwrite onCreatePreferences. And that takes a saved instance state as well as this root key. So the root key is kind of the root of that screen. That's important, especially when you're dealing with more than one preference screen. So inside of onCreatePreferences, I'm going to call setPreferences This is kind of like, you can kind of think about it like our setContentView. But rather than inflating a layout and turning it into a bunch of views, setPreferences takes a preference screen file, our preferences.xml, and turns it into views. So we're going to call that with our preferences resource, our XML resource there, and then always pass in root key. So the only thing that changes here is really going to be this ID. But as long as we have one screen, typically we just call that screen preferences.xml, so it's going to be r.xml.preferences. That would only change if you called it something else. So once we've created the preferences XML, we've created the activity, we've created the fragment, we also need to add some navigation controls to be able to get to this screen. So in order to be able to get to the screen, we need to send an intent to start the settings activity, just like we would start any other screen. Okay. Now, you want to typically call that with start activity. Don't call that with start activity for result, things like that. If you need to respond to changes that happen on the screen, the right way to do that is with lifecycle methods or an event listener. If you're using, say, lifecycle methods, then you would say, well, on resume, let's go look for the new setting. Or if you're hooking up on change listener, then I would put the code in there and see, okay, here I need to update things when things change. Typically, you don't want to use start activity for result to respond to hearing changes here. So when a user is adjusting their preferences, that logic doesn't go in either of the two classes, settings or fragment. Correct. Typically, we don't put very much. We may put a little bit of logic in that fragment if we need to change the preference screen itself in response to the way the users change the preferences. But if we need to update things on other screens, not the settings activity, in response to those changing, that code does not go into settings activity or settings fragment at all. It goes into the relevant place where that setting's being used. So that's kind of the gist of it. So if we're using an options menu, that would go into on option item selected. That's where we respond to them picking an item, and that's where we're going to say, well, let's send this intent to start the settings activity. Similar thing if they're using a navigation drawer, then we would put it in the on item click listener. So with the options menu, which is our it's just typically the way that they're going to get here. It would look something like this. We'd say on option item selected. We get the item that they picked, grab the ID out of that, and then just switch. We say, okay, if they picked action settings, then we're going to start that activity using this intent, and that's it. Usually it's just that one line to start the settings activity. But this is the part that you have to set up yourself. None of the templates or tools will automatically create that for you, this line of code. So you'll have to go ahead and hook that logic up. Okay. So there probably will be additional items here, assuming you have more things in your menu. So that code would be here, and then you'll also have your default say, well, if it's none of the items in my menu, then let's go back and call the base class version of this. Okay. So let me pause here a minute and see if there are any questions with how to set that up. Jeremy, did I answer your question sufficiently with how that works? Any other questions? Just checking in. If you're here, can you say something in YouTube chat? Just checking that people haven't dropped off. Okay, good. Because I'm looking at my chart over here. I'm like, did I lose everybody? But I guess people are just not talking. So that's what happened. Okay. So that's kind of the setup for getting the options. So getting the settings activity to be there. Let's go ahead and take a quick break because we're at like 1 o'clock already. We're about an hour in. So let's come back at maybe 10 minutes from now. Let's come back at 1:45 and we'll go through the rest of these slides at that point. Okay. All right, sorry. So far, we've gone over the basics of how to set up a setting screen. What we want to dive deeper into now is a few other kind of related topics and related things that you'll need to do. So the first thing we want to talk about is default settings. When we set that up, set the preferences XML file up, you saw that we had to set default values for each of the preferences. So there's a few more things to maybe say about that. The first of which is to think about, well, what do we want the default settings to be? Okay, so there's a few guidelines that you want to follow as you're picking the default settings. So the default settings should be set to a value that most users would choose. If you were going to give them the option of all the different settings that you have, all the different settings that they could change it to, you're going to pick one that's going to work the best for most users. So that should be your default. Your default should also be the one that uses less battery power rather than more. You don't want your users to have to go in and make your app more battery efficient. It should just be battery efficient by default as a general rule of thumb. Okay, so if there's something that they need to go in to make it more battery efficient, well, it should probably already be battery efficient. So, for example, that might be that Bluetooth is automatically not used unless the user uses it. Versus maybe you have in your app that you say, well, we're going to use Bluetooth whether or not the user says use it. So that should be something that the user has to turn on because it uses battery. You also want your defaults to be things that have the least risk of both security and data loss. security breaches and data loss. So you want for sure. So for an example, there would be, let's say you have a button to archive or delete messages. Well, by default, that button should be to archive messages, not to delete by default. Archive meaning that it goes somewhere where the user can restore it later, rather than delete where it's permanently gone. There's no way to get it back. So the default should be something like that, where it's less likely to cause data loss. If there is things in there where the users maybe for convenience, they'd rather, if they try to delete a message or they go to the trash can icon, they want it to delete, not archive, then you can give that as an option for users. But the assumption is going to be that most users will want to, say, archive their message rather than delete their message. So you want to have that be the default, and if there's any sort of security configuration things, you want the default to be the more secure option, not the less secure option. So your default should be the one that most users should use the least amount of battery, should use less battery power, and it should not risk their security and should not risk them losing data. Also, you want to make sure that you don't want to interrupt. You want to interrupt them only when it's important. So what that means is your default notifications should be kind of tame. They should be a good middle ground where most users would want to know about these things, want to know about those notifications, but you don't want to turn things on by default that most users wouldn't necessarily want to get notified about. So then you have in settings the option for the user to turn on those additional notification pieces that the user might not normally, a lot of users might not necessarily be interested in. So that can save on battery life, especially if it's something where in order to support that notification, you have to check a service every hour. If you have that turned off by default, well then A, you're using less battery power, and B, you're not interrupting them for that thing that they may not care about. So those are all things to keep in mind. So the way we configure those defaults is going to be using that app default setting. So for instance here, I've set the default to be London, okay, on an edit text preference. We also need to initialize those settings. So when you start an app, there will be no shared preference file. First time you start an app, there will be no shared preference file. So if we want those defaults to be saved somewhere, I need to force the system. I need to tell the system to go create that file initially at the beginning. Because if I don't, then all my settings will come up null. And that's a problem that we'll talk about in a minute. Right here, why do I need to do that? Well, that can mean that I'm using different default values in different places in my code. So one of the things that you want to do immediately when your app starts, you can put this in the onCreate of your main activity. That's where they have it for the labs. Realistically, this is another thing that you really want to put in the onCreate of your application, because you want it to run once and only once when your application starts. This is really a very good case for putting this in onCreate in your application. Two things that this helps with, similar to other things that you might want to put in your application, it helps for unit tests, because unit tests or automated tests don't always go through your main activity. So they may start on a screen that's deeper in your code, or they may start in a class that doesn't trigger main activity to come up. So if they're relying on main activity to run, main activity may have never run for your automated tests. So however, while main activity may not have run, the application definitely will have. So anything you put in the application will still run, will still be ready if you're running, say, automated tests. It also works with services. If you've got services that start up without the user say on boot or other times, whether it be through the job schedule or other kinds of services, if they start up without the user actually entering your app, then that main activity code may never get to run. So your settings won't be defaulted the right way. So when you're defaulting things, usually the right place to put this particular line of code is going to be in the on crate of the application. Again, for automated test purposes as well as for service purposes, because it's not unusual at all to have some of these preferences control how your services work. That's probably the most important thing to have in your settings screen, is settings for how your services work, to be honest. So Preference Manager, we're going to call Preference Manager.setDefaultValues, and we're going to pass in 3 arguments. That first argument is this, which is the application context. The third argument is that preference reforce file. That's where it's going to load the default settings from. And then the third parameter is always going to be false. It's just always going to be false. So false says don't re-initialize, don't overwrite the user settings, only run this the first time. They call it read again, is what they call it in the code. But it's always going to be false, because you don't want to override what the user's already set. There's some kind of oddity with how it works anyway, where if you set it to true, it doesn't always override the default values. So you may want to use the true if the user is, say, trying to reset their settings, but it doesn't work just by itself. You have to do a clear. You have to clear the settings, and then clear the settings, apply, and then run this with true. Otherwise, it doesn't actually reset. So set default values. This is going to take all the values that are in your preferences.xml and actually save them out to your shared preferences file. Otherwise, if you don't call this method, your file will either not be there or just be empty with no settings in it, which means that your kind of default values you're going to have to litter all throughout your code, not just in your preferences XML. And that means that things can get out of sync. So if we're looking at, which we'll look at here in a minute when we're talking about saving and restoring settings, saving and retrieving. So that'll make more sense in a minute. But that's the line of code that we need to have happen at the beginning of our app in order for everything to get set up properly, so the default settings are actually saved out to the shared preferences file. Okay. So when it comes to, let's talk about saving and retrieving those settings. So when you're, as far as saving things go, you actually don't typically need to do anything. You typically don't need to write any code to save those settings. There are exceptions to that rule, just like there's exceptions to most rules. But typically the things that you're putting on your settings screen, that's the only place for them to change. So as long as that's the only place that the user can change them, no code's needed to save those settings. If you're going to potentially save those settings on another screen, then you will need to invoke shared preferences and use the editor to save it over there on that other screen as well as on the settings screen. But typically there's no code to write, hey, get the editor, save it, apply changes on the settings screen. That you get that all by default. So as long as we use the specialized, the app compat activity and the PreferenceFragment compat, we use those classes like we looked at in the previous slides, then that already deals with saving those those settings to a file. In order to read those preferences, we're going to use a shared preferences object. Now, the way we get that shared preferences object is different than what we looked at in 9.1. So in 9.1, if I remember, I just said new shared preferences. I told it, here's my context, here's my name of my file, which typically was the package name, and then I would say mode private. So when we're working with preferences, I'm not going to say new shared preferences. I'm not going to get the preferences object that way. I'm actually going to get it this way. So I'm going to say preference manager.get default shared preferences this. And that already goes and uses the kind of the default name for that shared preferences file. So any settings that we have now that we want to save to preferences, really regardless of whether or not I'm using a settings screen, this is still practical, kind of a good way to set things up. Is we're going to say preference manager get default shared preferences. If nothing else, that kind of future proofs me so that later if I change my mind and I do want a preferences screen, then I don't have to change a bunch of code. So we're going to say shared prefs is equal to preference manager dot get default shared prefs, and then I can go retrieve one of the settings. So shared pref dot get string, I give it the name of the value and what kind of the default or fallback value is. So here I'm going to say I want the fav underscore city setting, and if that's not been set, then use Jamaica instead. Okay, so this is what we would refer to as the fallback value. Sometimes it's referred to as the default value, but just for kind of keeping terminology straight here, I'm going to right now refer to that as the fallback value. Okay, so it's going to use that setting as long as there is no setting in the actual file. Okay, now where that gets interesting, and this is what I was talking about a minute ago, I've got a default value here in my preferences.xml. So here I've said that by default my favorite city is going to be London. Okay, so this is set in preferences.xml. Whereas, okay, now I go look at main activity where I'm trying to read this setting or some other activity, and I say shared pref get string fav city Jamaica. Okay, so I've got a fallback value here and a default value here. So if there is no shared preferences file, this is the value it's going to use. Or if that shared preferences file does not contain a fav city setting, it's going to use Jamaica. The reason I needed to call that line earlier, set default values, this line right here, the reason I need to call that in onCreate when the application starts is that's going to go save London to the shared preference file. Okay. If I don't call that, then there's going to be no favorite setting. There's going to be no favorite city setting in the actual file, and I'll end up with Jamaica instead of London. So that's kind of one of those things you have to be wary of. You have these fallback values here, but you also have default values in your preferences XML. And those can very easily get out of sync. It's really not hard. It's really not unusual for you get to a place where there's one setting here and one setting there. It may look kind of crazy to look at that and say, well, we should just set those both to London. Yes, we should both set those to London. But it's very easy to make that mistake and have Jamaica here and London there. Especially as your app evolves, where you may have one default in your preference as XML and you have another default in your Java code. So that's something to be very, very aware of. And that's why we call set default values at the beginning when the application starts, is to deal with issues like this. So if we've called set default values, then both of these cases get London as the beginning instead of one getting London and one getting Jamaica, basically. So the other thing we may want to do, we talked about how to save and load, save and restore values. We may also want to respond to changes to those preferences. Okay, so if I'm on the preferences screen specifically, this is just talking about the preferences screen, the settings activity. If I want to change how the settings activity looks dynamically, based on changes that they make to the preferences, this is how I'm going to handle that. Okay, so for instance, I may want to say, okay, if the user turns on this setting or sets these 2 or 3 settings this way, then I want to show some additional settings, some follow-up settings or related settings. Okay, So I may need to hide some things. I may need to show some things. I may need to disable and enable settings that are kind of dependent on that core, maybe switch or slider or whatever it may be. Okay. So another thing I may want to do is change the summary. So I may want to change the summary to reflect what the user picked. You'll remember that I mentioned earlier that there's a setting to say use simple summary kind of strategy. That will go ahead and just take the value the user picks, whether it's an edit text or a list preference. It'll go ahead and just put that value as the summary. But if you want to do something more complex where you say maybe I want to insert that word, the thing that they picked, into some sort of setting, then I may need to do something with an actual listener. I also may sometimes want to act on that setting. So for instance, if that setting changes the background or the color scheme or the theme of the settings activity, then I would need to react to that and change the background of the settings activity. Okay. So how do I respond? Am I going the right way? I'm going the wrong way. Okay. So in order to do that listening, I'm going to need to register an onPreference change listener in the onCreatePreferences method of the SettingsFragment. Okay, so in here we've got onCreatePreferences. You'll remember that the first line of code, the one line of code that we put in there, was set preferences from resource. That's kind of like our set content view, but instead of loading a layout, it's loading a preferences screen file. Okay, so we're going to call set preferences from view. That's going to go ahead and take all those preferences, turn them into views. And then from there, once it's inflated all of that, then we can start accessing and dealing with those preferences. So here I'm going to say find preference. Now notice I'm saying find preference, not find view by ID. Right? Find view by ID is the way I find a view on the screen. Here I want to find a preference. Okay, so I'm going to say find preference, and I'm going to pass in color_pref. So that's going to be the key for the preference that I'm interested in. I know that that is a list preference because I've said the user can pick a small number of colors. Can pick these 3 or 4 different colors. So I'm going to save that to a variable. And then I'm going to say colorPref.setOnPreferenceChangeListener. So I'm going to hook up a listener and say, when this preference changes, when the user changes it, then I want to go do something with it. Okay, so let's look at the next slide to see what I'm going to pass into there. Okay, so in this example, I'm going to say, take the preference, take the value that they just picked, and I'm going to change the background of the screen. Okay, so I've got setOnPreferenceChangeListener. That takes a preference.onPreferenceChangeListener object. I'm declaring this listener here anonymously. And so I need to implement the onPreferenceChange method. The onPreferenceChange method takes 2 things. It takes the preference object, the preference that actually changed. Okay, in this case, this pref is going to be the same as colorPref. And then it gives me the new value. Okay, now it's giving me it as an object because this listener needs to work regardless of what kind of setting it is, right? So if this is a switch or a checkbox, the new value is going to be some sort of Boolean type. If it's an edit text or a list preference, either of those things are going to end up producing a string as the new value. Okay, so in this case, I've got a list preference, which means that I'm going to get this new value is actually going to be a string. So here I have my method set my background color, not defined here, but the idea is I call that method, give it my value, and it's going to go change the background of the settings screen. So it's going to go change the background of the settings screen in response to what the new value is. And I'm casting the new value to a string because, again, knowing that it's a list preference, I know that that is actually a string and not just any generic object. So that's how I'm going to do that. You could potentially also say new value dot toString, but this is kind of the more recommended way to do that. So return true. and that to say, hey, we've handled this event. We've dealt with the preference change. Okay, so that's how I'm going to hook up my listener. But just to keep in mind, this is only if I need to make changes on the settings screen itself. Okay, if I need to have changes to the settings or the preferences affect other screens or my services, this is not the right way to do it. You'll need to use a different kind of listener in a different place in your code. Okay. So let's talk about summaries. Let's talk about how we can work with these summaries. So for true false values, there's an easy way to have it change messages. So if we're in the designer for that preference, again, it's kind of like the layout designer. We haven't looked at it yet, but basically we get sort of a layout designer just if for designing preferences, just like we would for, say, a layout. So those preferences have properties. So for true false, I can say summary on, show this, summary on, show that. So it will show that text based on if that box is checked or that switch is on or off. So if the switch is on, here's a checkbox. If the checkbox is on, it'll say you will be awoken for meals. And then if it's unchecked, it will say you will not be woken for meals. So that's available anytime you're dealing with true false values. If you're dealing with other kinds of settings, whether it be the list preference or it be the edit text preference, then we can change the summary dynamically one of two ways. We can either say on preference change listener and write the code ourselves, have complete flexibility about what we wanted to change it to, or we can just add the setting, app uses simple summary provider, and it will automatically just have the summary automatically update to whatever value the user entered or picked. So for most cases, this is good enough. That section option of just setting use a simple summary provider is good enough. It's usually all you need. But there are cases where you may want it to be something more advanced. So for instance, in this case, I'm dealing with the favorite city setting. I'm going to ask for that setting, again, using find preference. My key is fav city. I'm going to save that to the city preference object, which is type edit text preference. And then I'm going to hook up a listener just like I did before. But instead of saying set the background color, here I'm going to say, well, let's change the summary of the preference. So I'm going to say get string. We're going to get this string resource, rstring, fav city summary. I'm going to pass in the value that's going to be changed to. So that's going to give me the summary. This is how I would do that with translations in mind. So I'm going to use get string. Here's my string resource. So fav city summary is going to be your favorite city is %s. So %s is where I'm going to put, say, San Francisco or London or Hong Kong, whatever the user types in. So that way this can still get translated and it's not just stuck in English. So we're going to say get string to go do that. And then I'm going to say pref set summary, pass in the summary. That will change this here. So that's what I need to do if I want to have it be kind of more of a custom message when the user changes the value. Otherwise, it would just say San Francisco using this second strategy. It would just say San Francisco, it would just say London, it would just say Hong Kong. It wouldn't have that additional text here, your favorite city is blah. But most of the times that's good enough because usually your title does a good job of explaining what the setting is about. You only really need to do this if your title doesn't do a good job of telling the user really what's going on. So we've gone through how to set this up all manually. The last thing to look at in the slides is the SettingsActivity template, which will generate some of this code automatically for us and kind of get us kick-started. So the way that we get to this is through, you know how we create a new activity. We're going to say new activity, basic activity, new activity, empty activity. We've done that before. there's an additional template there. It's all the way down at the bottom of the list. It's called SettingsActivity. So we can use that template to create a settings activity for us. Okay. Now, typically this only works the first time. If you already have a settings activity, this is going to cause some issues. So we can do this if we don't have a settings activity yet, but once we have a settings activity, you're not really going to be able to use this template all that well. So this may simplify the process of getting your settings activity set up. It may not. Reason being is there's some code it generates that you may not need. You may end up having to make changes. So it might not actually make your process simpler using this. It may be easier to just start it with an empty activity or a basic activity and build it up from there, depending on what you're doing. So if we are using this template, it can generate it in one or two ways. It can either generate it as one screen, or it can generate it with multiple screens. So the first time you come in here, this setting will definitely be by default unchecked, which means that when you tell it to create, it's going to create a settings activity with just one preferences screen. If you check this box, then you're going to end up with a screen where, okay, here's your categories, and then you tap on that to go to the next screen, which actually has those individual categories of settings, which is good if you have more. If you have a lot of settings, again, the kind of trigger point there is if you have 16 or more settings, then you should probably do this with more than one screen, have these subscreens. But if you have fewer than 16 settings, which should be the case for everything we do here in this class, then you're going to want that all on one screen. Okay. So with just a single screen, if you use this template, here's what it will create. It will create settings up at the top. Let me remind you, you do want to set this, the parent activity. I'm going to set this to main activity so it goes back to main activity when you leave that. Otherwise, you won't get that arrow up here, and it won't apply the parent activity into your manifest. So you typically want to make that setting because you want to have some sort of back button from settings. So that will put that in there. If you're using the template, it will create these 4 settings for you. So it creates your signature, which is an edit text setting. It'll create this default reply action, which is a list setting, and then we'll create these 2 dependent switch preferences. But it'll all put this on one screen, okay? Which is, again, usually what you're going to want, just one screen. But the template goes ahead and adds these 4 settings. Usually for most apps, I'm just going to scrap all those, make my own settings. This is just kind of placeholder to get you started. But typically we're going to remove all 4 of those settings and then put in just what we want. If you create it with the multiple screens template, here's how it's going to set up. So when you go into settings, it's going to have a messages category basically, and the sync category. So, but these, instead of all being on one screen, they're going to take you to separate preferences screen. So here's my headers sort of screen, and then it's going to take my messages screen or my sync screen. So that's how it looks if you on the wizard here, you just check that box. If you check that box, then it's going to look like that second example instead of looking like the first. So if you don't check that box in, it's just going to be here with one screen. If you do check that box, it's going to be with those 3 separate screens. But these will still be all in one settings activity. The way it actually implements these 3 different screens are through 3 different settings fragments. There are 3 different fragments, even though it's on the same activity. You actually never leave the activity as you're going between these. So this right here, this template, this is one of the things that's actually made the lab very much outdated, because Android Studio used to generate a very different sort of chunk of code. It generated a very different settings activity when you went through there. When you went through that wizard than it does now. It generated a lot more code, and in some ways it was a little bit hacky, and to the point where one of the labs is actually to go fix a bug in the template. I think that's actually the coding challenge, if I remember right. So this has changed to a big deal, which is going to mean that it's going to change how we do task 2 when we do the practical part, as well as the change to preferences being moved into Jetpack is going to change our first task as well as we do the practical. So those are the kind of the two big things that have affected the labs, is the switch to Jetpack and the template activities really been reworked. So that changes what we have to do for the labs. So that's kind of the overview. We talked about how to create the settings activity just from scratch. And then we talked briefly about how to use the template to create that settings activity with just kind of a few button clicks. Now, the thing to know here, while the template activity will create these screens for you, it will not create the menu that gets you here. So you still have to provide a way for the user to get to the settings activity, even if you use this template. Okay, so that's all we have for the slides. If you do want to read up more, there's a whole article about the settings. You actually followed this here because it's a worthwhile tutorial to follow through. This one's actually been updated to Jetpack if you follow that link. I'm going to paste this into the YouTube stream. Just in the chat, into the chat. This will actually go through what it looks like in the new Jetpack, including it kind of mentions that the new dependency here is Android X.Preference, Preference 1.1.0. So this tutorial actually does go through the new process of what's changed. I've already updated the slides to reflect that. But if you're looking for where to do this online, this is definitely the tutorial, the guide that I would push you towards, because it's been updated to Jetpack. And that's it. And we'll do the practical portion of this, and let's see, it's 2:20. So we'll start I think I'll start the practical portion of this up at 4:30. Or no, sorry, not 4:30, 3:30. I can't talk apparently. So we'll start the practical portion of this up at 3:30. Before I close out the stream, does anybody have questions that I can answer here?